All right, hello everyone. My name is Ms. Crossman, and this is going to be our first module of lecture notes. So today we are beginning Unit 1. This video is going to cover Module 1. So we're going to get started. Okay, so Module 1, these are our learning targets or learning objectives. By the end of this module, you should be able to explain how psychology is a science and why the rat is always right. Describe the 3 key elements of the scientific attitude and how they support scientific inquiry. Explain how critical thinking feeds a scientific attitude and smarter thinking for everyday life. Describe how psychology developed from early understandings of mind and body to the beginnings of modern science. Describe some early important milestones in psychology's early development, and explain how behaviorism, Freudian psychology, and humanistic psychology furthered the development of psychological science. Now, most times in videos, I'm not going to read all those, but since this is our first one, I did. In the future, you might want to pause and write these down, or you can come back to it at the end of your notes, see if you've hit all those. Okay, so first of all, when lots of people think of psychology, I don't typically think they think of it as a science, but psychology really is a science. It's this desire to explore and understand without misleading or being misled. That's what science is, or our definition. And the scientific attitude has 3 key elements, which is curiosity. So curiosity is what is kind of needed to even start the scientific process, right? You have to have a question about something. So this asks the original questions that prompt a scientific investigation. The second is skepticism. So when we are thinking and using a scientific attitude, we need to be skeptical of the things that people are telling us, even your teachers. You need to be skeptical about what they're saying. Ask them for the evidence. Where did you get this concept from? How do you know that this is true? And then lastly, humility. Scientists need to be able to humble themselves in the sense that they're not always right. They need to be able to understand that even though they might have had a hypothesis they thought that was correct, it might not be correct, and have the humility to be able to do so. So when we say the rat is always right, what we mean is that though we as humans may make predictions about, let's say, a rat's behavior, how they're going to respond, that animal or organism or human may respond in ways that we didn't predict. And therefore, the rat is always right. They're the ones who are actually exhibiting the behavior. And we have to have the humility to be able to accept our miscalculations sometimes. So critical thinking is another huge portion of the scientific attitude. So critical thinking is a way of thinking that does not blindly accept arguments and conclusions. Rather, it examines assumptions, it appraises the source, meaning it looks at where the source is, kind of where it's coming from, who's paying for it, those kinds of things. It tries to discern the hidden biases and evaluate evidence and assess conclusions. So when you are being a critical thinker, you ask questions like, how do you know that? What is the person's agenda of what they're trying to convince you of? Is the conclusion based on a story, an anecdote, or on actual evidence? So these are the kinds of things we think about with critical thinking. So, for example, did you know that ice cream sales are related to increases in violent crime? This is true. This is actually true. Did you know that ice cream sales are related to increases in violent crime? I want you in your notes to answer for me why you think that is, and we'll talk about it in class. Now, things that make sense aren't always accurate, and sometimes things that make no sense are actually scientifically proven through research. So, for example, sleepwalkers are not acting out their dreams. That is something that would make sense to us, but that's not actually what's going on. Another thing that makes no sense, but actually is true, is that they have found in research that massive losses of brain tissue early in life may have minimal long-term effects. That makes no sense, but that is part of the scientific process, learning about what we think is true and what is actually true. So what matters is not what we feel is right or true. What matters is what is true based on experimentation and research. All right, so the beginnings of psychology, pre-scientific psychology, as some of us call it, really started way back in the before the Common Era, so in the 400s BC. Some famous Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, started kind of talking about the mind, the human body, kind of how that all interacts. So Socrates and Plato, they believed that the mind is separate from the body and that it continues after the body dies. So kind of like a soul. And they believed that knowledge is innate, like you are born with all of the knowledge and the personality you're going to have. Aristotle, who was actually Plato's student, is probably one of the most famous Greek philosophers. He actually said the opposite because he was what we call an empiricist. He loved data. He wanted to see actual observable, tangible things. So he observed over and over and over, and he concluded that knowledge is not pre-existing, but rather it grows from the experiences stored in our memories. So basically, life experiences cause us to gain knowledge, which is what the science supports today. Then in the 1600s in France, René Descartes, he kind of went back to this idea of dualism, which is what Socrates and Plato believed in. The idea that the mind and the body are separate. Now, religious beliefs, that might tell you that the mind and body are separate, and that's totally good to think. Now, in science and psychology, though, we really can't study things that we can't see, like the mind, right? So science believes in the idea of monism, the idea that the mind and the brain are one and the same. Whereas René Descartes, he believed that the mind and body are separate entities, and this is what we call dualism. Then in the 1500s and 1600s in Britain, Sir Francis Bacon, you've probably heard of him. He was the founder of the scientific method. He was fascinated with human mind and its failings. And so he understood the brain's ability to perceive patterns, even in random events. John Locke, in the same kind of era, this time frame, he wrote an essay concerning human understanding. That's the title of it, where he argued that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. So this idea kind of helped form modern empiricism. That's that word again, empiricism. The idea that what we know comes from experience and observation and experimentation enables scientific knowledge. So basically, what we know, what we have learned comes through experience. And so for us to learn things scientifically, we need to observe them actually. We can't just theorize. We have to actually test and observe them. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead a little bit. And in 1879 is when the first psych laboratory was made in Leipzig, Germany. I think I'm saying that right, by Wilhelm Wundt. And he was a professor, and he had two assistants, and they created this experimental machine, which is actually pretty interesting for the time. This machine measured how long it took people to press a telegraph key after hearing a ball hit a platform. So he basically wanted to test our reaction time. And what he found was that when he asked people to press the key as soon as it occurred, they responded in 1/10 of a second. But when asked to press the key as soon as they were consciously aware, they actually took 1/10 of a second more. So perceiving it and being consciously aware of it, what he found was that it takes us longer to be consciously aware of something. In 1883, G. Stanley Hall establishes the first U.S. psych laboratory. So he's kind of called the father of American psychology. And then quickly after its inception, psychology started organizing into different schools of thought. So the early ones are structuralism, functionalism, and behaviorism. So structuralism was this early school of thought that was promoted by Wundt and Titchener, his student Edward Titchener. And really their goal was to find the structures of the mind. That's why we call it structuralism. So they use this process called introspection, where they basically ask people to think about their own thinking to reveal the structure of the human mind. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this more in class, but it wasn't that successful. Then comes functionalism, which was founded by William James. And functionalism Rather than trying to identify the different structures of the brain, James wanted to understand the functions of the different parts of our brain. Why do we do these things? Why do we have this part of our brain? What's the function of that? So he really wanted to understand why we have these different behaviors. Now, William James, he was a professor at Harvard. In 1890, he admitted the first woman into his graduate seminar, Mary Whiton Calkins. Now, Mary, she took all the PhD courses. She was the top of her class. However, because of the time and the sexism against women at the time, she was denied a PhD by Harvard. So she had to earn it at a different women's college. But she later became the first female president of the APA. Her predecessor, she was her predecessor. Margaret Floy Washburn actually was the first psychology PhD who was a female. And she wrote The Animal Mind, a book about animal behavior. And she was the second female APA president. Okay, so psychological science matures. So we're moving away kind of from the structures of the mind and the functions of the mind. And in the 1920s comes behaviorism, which is a field of psychology that really only wanted to focus on observable behaviors. It wanted to focus on what we could see, what we could actually observe and take data on, rather than kind of these intangible things like the structures of the mind. So behaviorism was the view that psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. And the big wigs in this one were John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. We will talk at length about them later, but those are the big guys for behaviorism. Then comes our guy, Sigmund Freud. And Freud is pretty famous for being the founder of the psychoanalytic method, which was also a huge player in the 1900s for psychology. And psychoanalysis really looks at how our unconscious mind and unconscious desires and childhood experiences might be driving some of our behaviors, especially the problematic ones. And then later down the road in the 1960s, these were kind of like the hippie psychologists, you could say. A field of psychology called humanism emerged, which these psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, they wanted to look at the goodness of humans and how we can be our best selves, rather than focusing kind of on the negative parts. Now, this is our last slide for Module 1. I want you to answer these questions in your notes, and we will go over them together in class. See you later.